I'd like to welcome our viewers to our conversations with the authors of the Journal of Educational Controversy. We are a journal that is published at the Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University. My name is Lorraine Kasperson. I'm the editor of the Journal of Educational Controversy. My guest today is Dr. Thelma Jackson, who published an article in our journal called Educational Malpractice in Our Schools, Shortchanging African American and Other Disenfranchised Students. Dr. Jackson is the founder and owner of Foresight Consultants in Olympia, Washington. She has a long history of leadership in education in Washington State and has served on many important boards and commissions and has received many awards and recognitions for her outstanding educational and community service. For example, she has served on task force and advisory councils for the for 5 governors of the state of Washington, including the Governor's Council on Education Reform and Funding. That, by the way, had resulted in the state education's reform law. Dr. Jackson also served on the advisory council for the implementation of House Bill 2722, the legislation that was dealing with the closing the achievement gap for African American students in our state. Dr. Jackson has served on numerous leadership capacities, such as the president of the Washington State School Directors Association. She has served as the chair of the Commission on African American Affairs. She has been the president and served on the Board of Trustees of the Evergreen State College, and I could go on and on with other accolades. Dr. Jackson received her Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She also received doctorates in educational leadership and change from Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara, California. Let me welcome you, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Lorraine.
I thought we might begin with a section in your paper that you wrote, The Persistent Miseducation of African American Students. And since you wrote your paper, the Seattle Times last March reported that the U.S. Department of Education was conducting an investigation of the Seattle public schools, and they found some very troubling and some very stark statistics. For example, African American students were suspended from school more than 3 times as often as white students from elementary to high schools. More than 1/4 of black middle school students have received short-term suspensions every year since 1996. 1/4 every year since 1996. We know the statistics around the achievement gap, the dropout rate, and yet despite all our efforts and reform movements, it remains a very, very persistent problem. And I was wondering, perhaps you could share your thoughts about what accounts for what you call the miseducation of African American students.
Well, the article in the Seattle paper that you referenced actually verified what has been known for quite some time. Facts that have been denied by the public school system as to what's going on. When we talk about that disproportionality in discipline, we can directly correlate those numbers to who's in the achievement gap. And the energies and the efforts and the dollars and the programs and the activities over the last 8 to 10 years, so-called to close the achievement gap, has moved the needle very little. And with Seattle's problem being exposed, it's important for people to realize that any district in the state of Washington could have been targeted by the U.S. Office of Education, and very similar data would have come forward. Any of those districts with a significant population of African American students. But only until recently has that disproportionality in discipline been tied back to the lack of academic achievement, the contributing factors to the achievement gap. It goes back to a number of other factors that the research over years have pointed out. The fact that there are low expectations for certain groups of kids in our schools, and certainly African Americans. Even within the ranks of the African American population, the male African Americans suffer even more than the general numbers. So for those numbers that you quoted a minute ago, if they were disaggregated by gender, you would find that males far outreached females. And so that led me to a number of considerations that has eventually settled into work looking at the school to prison pipeline. So the same numbers are reflected in the incarceration numbers. So who's incarcerated in our prisons are the very same people who are disproportionately disciplined, the very same people who are caught in the achievement gap. So given that trail, given that track, given those facts, at what point do we stop blaming the students and begin to talk about the system's failure of the students? And I focus in quite often on African American students, not because they look most like me, but because they can be referred to as the canary in the mine. If this is what's happening to this group of students, then we know the rest of the system is suffering as well. And so as I reviewed that paper that I wrote in '06, I was surprised at how much has become revealed since that happened with the earlier days of the journal. The research has certainly caught up. The school systems have not. And unfortunately, it's taken the federal compliance agencies to come in and to point out to school districts where they are failing certain groups of students. That's true also of low-income students. That's true of non-English speaking students. That's true of so many of the disenfranchised children in our systems, the homeless, and on and on and on. So if we can fix it for African American students, we will have improved the system for all students.
Yeah, very often people compare the African American experience with the experience of all immigrants who've come to our shores and who have experienced difficulties. And in your paper, you argue that one cannot really make that kind of a comparison, that it's not a valid comparison. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that.
Well, I contend that it's not a valid comparison from the point of view of African Americans were not immigrants to these shores. My ancestors were brought here as enslaved people, stolen from their country, in chains, treated as inhumans, actually was considered under the Constitution as property, against the law to be educated, against the law to know how to read, against the law if you were caught trying to teach us how to read. No other group of people coming to this country has come under those conditions. And for that reason alone, it was 1954, before the Brown versus Board of Education decision was rendered that outlawed separate and unequal. Not that it was outlawed, however. It took 10 more years for the Civil Rights Act of '64 before states, especially southern states, began to act even though the '54 law said with all due speed. And so there has been a tremendous need to catch up, a tremendous need of denial of education, with education being directly related to economics, to human endeavor in general. No other group has been denied their personhood, has been denied their religion, names stripped away, language taken, and essentially treated as property and animals. No other group can make that comparison. And it's for that reason that I contend that, yes, other immigrant groups have come to these shores. They came voluntarily, first of all, and didn't come in shackles and chains, and were helped along, protected with rights in this country. My group was not.
How do you think you would respond to people who then say, well, this is 2013 and things have changed? How would you explain how the legacy of that historical legacy that you talk about still continues to affect the progress of African Americans today?
Yes, a lot of time has passed, but we're still a discriminatory country. We're still a country of inequity. We're still a country of bigotry and prejudices. And the color of one's skin has a lot to do with who is subjected to those kinds of indifferences. So while time has passed, actually not very much time has passed. We're talking about a few decades. So when you are coming from behind the line to start with, and when you've been continuously subjected to indifferences, the opportunities have not been there, the access has not been there equally in amounts that would have allowed some equalizing and some equilibrium of groups. And one has to understand the history of this country, the past history and the current activities of this country. As recently as this past election, African Americans had to fight for the right to vote. Every 10 years, the Voting Rights Act is renewed in Congress. People don't realize that something as basic as the right to vote is renewed every 10 years for black folk. And so we have not reached that level of equality that is the rhetoric of this nation. And until we do, we find a lot of manifestations in our school system, especially our public education system, such that access and opportunity is not there in equal terms. We talk about the disproportionality in discipline, but we also peel back the data and we look at the disproportionality of who's in special education, the disproportionality of who's not in highly capable, gifted, and advanced placement courses, the disproportionality of who's dropping out, who's not graduating, who's not going to college, the disproportionality of who's incarcerated. And we don't make a correlation between the culture of this country, the inequities of this country, but it's easier to blame the victim than it is to look at the practices of the country that results in the kind of manifestations we look at.
How might you think about approaching the problem? Despite all of the reform movements and efforts and changes that we've seen, as I mentioned, the problem persists. What do we need to do to address the problem as you see it?
Well, the reform movement, as we call it, trying to make changes in education, and I certainly have been a steadfast advocate for whatever opportunity that was to call for change. But very little change has been made. When we look at our current American public education system, 90 to 95% of it is still as it was, as originally conceived and put into place over 250 years ago. Nothing's changed. We have tinkered around the edge of the box. The status quo is still maintained. When the original system of education was put into place, it never was intended to educate people of color, to educate females, to educate anyone other than white, Protestant, male, upper class people. And our schools today are anything but that. We have become this cornucopia of diversity. And that diversity brings different worldviews, different learning styles, different experiences, different backgrounds. Yet we continue to dispense education as though we are still one homogeneous group of folk of the same belief system, same religious system, same worldview, and that's not the case. So we're in denial that this country has changed. And so much change has happened, but education as an institution has seen the least amount of change of any of our systems. So yes, there's been tinkering, there have been innovations here and there, but for the most part, education has not changed.
What kind of changes would you like to see?
Starting with the reality of who the students in today's schools are. Starting with the reality of the fact that education is not relevant to the average young person today. That contributes to the dropout rate. That contributes to the tune-out rate. That contributes to so much that's going on in school. We start there with who are our students, what are their needs, and what is the world that they're going into, and how can we best equip them to be successful in that world. And there's little going on in our schools that meet that recipe, so to speak. All you have to do is ask any average sophomore, junior in high school, and they'll tell you, what bores them to death, what they wish school did look like, and they're off into high-tech land. And our schools are still dealing with manual kinds of ways of learning. So there's a disconnect between the needs of our students and what our schools are dispensing.
You talk about in your paper the importance of having high expectations for all students. And I was thinking about that a lot. It's one of those terms, high expectations, that we use a lot in colleges of education, telling our prospective teachers that they must have high expectations for all students. And I read an article by Lisa Delpit once, and it made me think about the subtlety of that concept. For example, she talks about some research that was done where the researcher took stories, oral stories, that were told by first graders, black first graders and white first graders, and she recorded them. They were told in different discourse styles. She left out any dialectical markers but just read the story itself. And then she gave that recording to a group of white teachers or white adults and a group of black adults. And she asked them to listen to the two stories and to assess them, and then to also try to predict the success of the students in the future in academic achievement. Now, the white students tended to write in a discourse style that was more expository. It tended to be topic-centered on one kind of event. And the black students tended to speak in a more episodic narrative form, talking about, making many more associations. It tended to shift more from scene to scene. And so there were two distinct styles, and the adults, both black and white, saw the differences, could sense the differences in the styles. And yet, when it came time to assess those differences, the white teacher saw it as, saw the black students' oral style as incoherent. This is not even one person said this is not telling a story of any kind. And the black teachers described or assessed it in very different ways. They saw it as very expressive, great use of metaphors, wonderful associations. And when it came time then to predict future student achievement, the white adults found that the children writing in that more episodic narrative of the black children found that, oh, they're going to have problems in reading. The language problems are going to present problems for them in academic achievement. They even drew inferences on the child's emotional problems, on the child's family problems. And the black adults wrote things like, oh, this child is very verbal. This is an exceptional child who's going to achieve greatness in the future. And so here we have not only a different assessment of the two styles, but we have a prediction about their future based upon that. Now, both sets of children need, obviously, to develop a repertoire of different styles. But if teachers already are coming in denigrating what the children are bringing from home, what kind of expectations do they really have? They may profess to have high expectations without realizing that they're taking that home, what the children bring from home, and already denigrating it without realizing it, perhaps. And so I've been thinking about this whole notion of high expectations and the importance of cultural familiarity that is important here. I was wondering, what do our teachers need to understand about the culture of black children in order to better understand and see the brilliance that they bring to the schools?
The culture of black children, the culture of brown children, the culture of low-income children, the culture of non-English speaking children. First, they need to realize that there is more than one culture. There's more than a white middle-class culture, a European Western culture. And when they want all of the kids to fit into that little hole, and when you don't fit, you get all these labels. And hence comes the low expectations. So this is one of the reasons you see so few black children and brown children in highly capable courses and in advanced placement courses and gifted courses, because someone's made the conclusion, has drawn the conclusion that that child is not fit for those advanced classes. So when you've started school and there are low expectations of you along the way, at some point you just say, oh well, versus how many gifted students have we missed along the way because we have these preconceived notions of who they are, what they know, what they don't know. But they come with a different worldview. They come with a different set of experiences. They come from a different home setting. They come where language is treated differently. No acknowledgement of the fact that most African American students are kinesthetic, oral, high-touch learners, which is just the opposite of sit down, be quiet, keep your hands to yourself, and don't speak until called upon. Just the opposite, which also leads right into the disproportionality in discipline. And the discipline comes in the manner of disrespect, classroom disruption. So this low expectation is real. And cultural competency training as a requirement for people in our schools, because that's another disconnect of who the teachers are and who the students are. They're still predominantly middle-class white women, especially in elementary. And so it is what it is. And that's not going to change anytime soon, given the feeder system that's not in place. So what do? You help the current workforce understand that there are some differences about your children, but differences don't mean deficit. It's looked at as a deficit versus a positive. Oh, look at the variety of children we have in this class. Everyone's going to learn from each other this year. and as they go through their educational process, will have better understandings of each other, can respect each other differently. But when that's not the case, starting from the teacher, him or herself, then therein lies problems for that student. When I have a teacher tell me in some of my consultant work that they're afraid of black students, they're an elementary teacher. I'm afraid of black boys. What is it about this 10-year-old child that you're afraid of? I don't know. I just know I'm afraid of him. But you do know he knows that you're afraid of him. He senses that. How can he learn from you if you're treating him differently out of fear? So there are some dynamics going on in our schools and in our classrooms that we have a very difficult time discussing. There are some significant, courageous conversations we are not having. But it's easier to take a look at assessment data and test scores and chalk it up to the child, the education of the parent, their zip code, where they live, their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomics, versus what aren't we doing effectively that this group of children is not learning. And maintenance of the status quo, like I said a few minutes ago, is what motivates so many in the system, versus what changes can we make to ensure that larger numbers of our students are succeeding as they go through this process.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions that you might make to colleges of education, for example, in the preparation of teachers? What would a culturally responsive curriculum look like in teacher education, do you think?
I think colleges of education play a key role in the problems we're facing. People would like to think that the achievement gap is a K-12 systems kind of issue, but the colleges of education who turn out the teachers and the principals really need to re-examine their curriculum and what kind of exit outcomes are they requiring of the people that are coming out of schools. I talk sometimes to fresh graduates out of colleges and universities in education. And on more than one occasion, I've had several say to me, I was not prepared for the reality of that diverse multicultural classroom that I walked into on day one. I had one multicultural elective course. I had no cultural competency training. I didn't hear anything about culturally responsive teaching, and on and on and on. So if colleges of education, who also need to face the reality of how schools have changed, and then better prepare teachers, principals, administrators for what they are going to be faced with, it wouldn't fall on that teacher to try to do self-improvement. It wouldn't fall upon that school district through professional development trying to bring about those things. They would come with some of that as a college graduate from a college of education. But there again, there's some need for some courageous conversations that aren't happening.
What particular would you include in a culturally responsive curriculum? What would students learn actually in that kind of a curriculum?
Well, it's not a course per se. It's a concept. It's infused throughout the entire curriculum, no matter what the subject is, from math to social studies to history. You show the inclusion of people. You help students, all the students, understand and realize that there's been a presence of all kinds of people over thousands of years in what we know as the acquisition of knowledge, that is not in a European stronghold. When you're teaching math, to teach the Asian origin of it, the African origin of it, for a black child or an Asian child to feel some pride in the fact that everything didn't originate in Europe. When you're teaching history and social studies, included as it was, not as it's been doctored, as the elimination of so many contributions. And so that's culturally responsive teaching. That's teaching it from different vantage points and not just one all the time. And that needs to be a part of the curriculum in colleges of education, so that us teacher candidates can understand what culturally responsive teaching is, what culturally inclusive instruction looks like, so that this panel of teachers you were talking about, they would understand, say this group of white teachers would understand the richness and the value of oratory in the black culture, so that it's not discredited to say you did a wonderful job with your metaphors and your oratory. Now we're going to work on translating that into, so you help make the transition, but you acknowledge, what the children come to school with and go from there. And so many of the prejudgments have to go away. That can be taught in colleges of education.
And when you use the term courageous conversations, that is very, very difficult to do. We've been covering in our journal and on our blog the events that have been happening in Tucson, Arizona, when the state decided they were going to ban the Mexican American curriculum out of
ethnic studies.
Right. And here you have a curriculum that was responsive to students. They were, according to the state's own audit that they commissioned, were doing quite well with this kind of curriculum, and yet the state was afraid of it, afraid to and so they banned it. So those courageous conversations really need to be done on a national level. We've got
every level,
right?
Every level, because one of the courageous conversations that we're not having as a nation is the degree to which institutional racism is alive and well, and that incident in Arizona is a typical example of institutional racism. From the legislature, from the governor, and imposed upon the public school system. That is the predominant group of learners in that area. So through ethnic studies, they are learning about the contributions of their people. Again, if everything is all European based and you can never see anything you can relate to, you begin to say, well, this education isn't for me. So ethnic studies, African studies, you name it, those have come and gone over time. But it's due to institutional racism that there is no acknowledgement of the value that these kinds of studies have on the academic achievement of students.
I know that you founded the African American think tank, which evolved into the multi-ethnic think tank, and I think that's when we first met each other.
Yes, years ago.
What was the goal of the think tank, and what effect did it have on legislation here in Washington State in trying to make a difference in what we're doing?
The goal, there were several goals, but the primary goal was to expose the inequities of the education system as related to those ethnic groups. And even way back then, African American students were pulling up the rears on test scores and all of the indicators that we had. We could go back 20 years to CTBS, and the name of the test changed, but the results had not changed. And so no one seemed to care. It didn't seem to matter to anyone. The dropout data, the graduation date, and all, it didn't seem to matter. It was just business as usual. So the primary goal of the think tanks the primary goal was to expose and to surface and to educate people to what was going on, so that we could be a part of the solutions and not just continuously pointing fingers at the system. We're part of the system too. And once the African American think tank came into being, the other ethnic groups followed suit, including the low socioeconomic think tank. So as you said, there were 5 that made up the multi-ethnic think tank. In our heyday, I think we got some, we made some progress as far as raising consciousness level, helping the legislature, helping OSPI, helping State Board of Education and others become more sensitive to what was going on. Leadership was always an issue. We never could get OSPI to, we couldn't get traction. We couldn't get traction. It remained a side activity of the agency. And as time went on, as the situation became much more critical, the African American think tank essentially dissolved, but our efforts didn't stop. We now have an entity we call the Black Education Strategy Roundtable, constantly interacting with the legislature, constantly testifying at hearings, constantly providing research information, trying to make sure that there is some awareness about the inequities and the disparities of what's going on in this state and how it's impacting African American students and African American communities. And I think the think tank was ahead of its time. And so it played itself out, and we just had to pick up from there and move on to the next train that was moving.
Has any legislation come out of the of Washington State Legislature that was responsive to your concerns?
Well, the House Bill 2722 that you referenced, that was a piece of legislation directly related to trying to bring some focus on African American achievement. And that bill was passed. We did have hearings. An Achievement Gap Oversight Committee, another bill the following year, was put into place, and there continues to be a group looking at the achievement gap with the oversight responsibilities. A number of things we've zeroed in on as the Black Education Strategy Roundtable now. We've looked at courses, we've looked at opportunity, we've looked at access. So the legislature passed this year an academic acceleration bill. Why aren't there more kids of color in advanced placement, in international baccalaureate? And it's these reasons we talked about, the mentality of some who don't think black kids can handle it. And as a result of it, you're never recommended for those courses. So there's a bill now that puts it in a whole different perspective. We tried to get it mandatory, but it's voluntary. We wanted an opt-out clause so that all students who meet the standards of the state would now qualify, and if they so chose to be a part of that AP, they could. But you would be put in there, and you and your parent had to opt you out. We weren't able to persevere on that, so the bill passed without the opt-out clause. But at least it's directing school districts to provide more access for academic acceleration. We have a bill coming out that's dealing with the disproportionality in discipline and the school to prison pipeline. Bringing some focus on what is going on in our schools and how the schools have become complicit in providing the raw material that's feeding this mass incarceration pipeline. And so you have to work really hard at digging up the data and, glaring it up there in the hearing rooms, and you hear the, oh my God, we had no idea it was to that extent. Well, the districts, the system should know. It's the system's data that we're using. So we know we have to just keep working at it, keep going at it uh, until we see these gaps close, the opportunity gaps, the resource gaps, you know, and all of these gaps that's manifested as the achievement gap. And until we see those dropout rates go down, those graduation rates go up, until we see our students exiting the schools without needing remediation in community college, and universities, it's going to be a long time coming. But we've advocated for things like preschool. We've advocated for things like all-day kindergarten. So if we can start down there, we can help with that socioeconomic, socio-emotional development of those students. They're going to stand a much better chance as we push for cultural competency training of all staff. You know, and those kinds of things. So it's very, very hard work. It's like swimming upstream.
You're right. Yes, it's a long struggle. You know, one of the things that we try to do in these interviews is to help our readers see the person behind the article, to humanize the authors. And as you talk about the struggle that we've been pursuing in this country, maybe you could share with our audience what your own struggle was. What kind of experiences in your life led you to become the dynamic force in educational leadership that you are today?
Well, Lorraine, let me relate a very recent incident in my life. A couple of weeks ago, I returned from Mobile, Alabama, attending my 50th high school class reunion. And I was the historian of my class, so I kept up the history and I presented when we usually go back and get together. And in this history, I make the point that our class of 1963 was fortunate in that we missed integration. We missed integration. We didn't have to contend with issues of low expectations, culturally insensitive people. It was an all-black education system. We were challenged to the highest extent of our capability. And as we looked back over our 50 years at the many teachers and nurses and principals and 4 doctorates out of that class and on and on and on. And then when we look at the class, starting with the class of 67, our schools were totally disrupted with integration. And we can point directly to the beginning decline of academic achievement of black kids in my hometown to the day that those schools were dispersed. Our teachers and administrators were dispersed, and we no longer have that cultural conclave where we could go and be the best we could be. We didn't have to concern ourselves with who we were or our sense of self-worth, our sense of self-esteem. And we were nurtured and cared for and loved and prepared for integration. But in that segregated setting, we got the best that those black teachers could give us. And fortunately, we had about 7 of those present at our 50th class reunion. And so my background of growing up in the Deep South, under Jim Crow laws, in segregated schools, with a lack of access and opportunity, even though I graduated valedictorian with a 4.0 in a class of 250, I had no access to colleges and universities in Alabama. Now that's the climate in 1963 under which I grew up. I certainly, as a young black girl with dreams of being a scientist one day, I went to school in Louisiana at Southern University, historical black college, where I could find that kind of encouragement. And so that's the only way I became a biochemist. So employment recruiting by Battelle Northwest in Richland, Washington in 1968 is what brought me to the Northwest. And that background that I had where I knew that one's skin color, the socioeconomics, your zip code, your address, the educational level of your parents had nothing to do with your intellect, your intelligence, and your ability to learn. And that has served me as I've participated in thousands of discussions about why black kids can't learn, and I won't buy it. Because we learned at high rates, and we were very successful in our adult lives. And so had I not had that experience, I might have bought some of the crappy conclusions and hypotheses and theories that are out there about why this achievement gap exists, why are so many blacks incarcerated, and on and on. No. I had a different experience. And thank God I had a different experience. And so that's why I said to my class, we were blessed by having missed integration, but it better prepared us for a segregated adult life.
What were some of the characteristics of the teachers in those schools? I think Lisa Thelma talks about warm demanders.
That's a good description.
What, could you tell us a little bit about what the teachers were like in those segregated schools that you grew up in?
They were very respectful of us. They cared for us. They were very stern. Failure is not an option in here. We had no dropouts. We had no discipline problems. One or two, just human nature kind of things. We had strong ties and relationships to our homes, to our communities. They lived in our communities, went to church together. You would see them in the grocery stores. So it wasn't like they got in a car at 3 o'clock and you didn't see them again to Monday morning kind of thing. They were there at your activities, your plays, your sports. You walk into a class, good job with that poem Friday night in the oratorical contest, that kind of thing. And they would not let you fail. They would not let you fail. And it was quite a difference. And it was, we talked a bit about how our teachers made a way out of no way. But we learned. We learned. We didn't just memorize and regurgitate. We learned. And they saw to it that we learned, because they knew once we left the safety of that school, that the challenges we would face, we had to be the best we could be. We weren't permitted to use slang and dialect as we talked. It was corrected right on the spot, because they knew that would not serve us well as we went through life. That's not the case anymore. When we, when I look at my math teachers, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, chemistry, physics, these were brilliant people. And they taught and they retaught until we learned it. Okay, obviously too many of you didn't get it that time. Let's try again. Until you learned it. And so that was peer mentoring. It wasn't called that then. But when I think of all the practices that were in place, there are words for it now, and they recognize the needs of the students. But they never let the individual circumstances of the student determine the degree to which they would challenge you and hold you accountable for learning.
In classrooms today, in today's school, many theorists like John Ogbu, the anthropologist, talks about the sort of oppositional collective identity and the burden of acting white. What is going on here? What is that phenomenon all about?
That's part of what we were celebrating. We came up not having to worry about acting white in our all-black setting. But if you're in an integrated setting, and my children and my grandchildren have experienced that. So if you're speaking properly, if you're smart, if you're actively involved, other black students say, oh, you're just acting white. You're not one of us. So if you don't make sure that that your children have a very strong sense of self-identity and self-worth, they could fall prey to that peer pressure. Well, I want to belong. I'm black. I want to belong. So I'm not going to do my homework. I'm not going to study. I might know that, but I'm not going to let anyone know I know that because I'll sound smart. And so it's this acting white kind of thing that peers have labeled you with. And as a parent, you prepare your children for that. Now you can expect to catch some stuff from other black kids who's not going to appreciate the fact that, you know, you're acing the test and you're in AP courses and you're president of the student body and on and on and on. But that's their problem, not yours.
Do you have any suggestions for schools and teachers and confronted with this phenomenon?
Well, I think a lot of that really has to start with the home and the family. The school can augment. The school can take it into consideration and make sure that as they see that promising student, see that spark in that student, that they keep that cultivated, and they do what they can to support students that are being tugged at and pulled at and bullied and harassed because they are performing at a level expected of them. If schools understand that acting white syndrome, they can help tremendously. But it's everybody. But more than anything, it's the student themselves. And I have a granddaughter. I have 4 granddaughters, but one granddaughter in particular, I'm leaving next week, going to North Carolina to her high school graduation. And she had an interesting conversation with me in about 8th grade. She said, you know, Grandma, so many of when she first moved to North Carolina from the state of Washington, she said they don't have any goals in life. They aren't even considering going to college. They talk all kinds of ways, and I've just got to separate myself from them because they are, if I mess around with them long enough, they could really be a bad influence on me. I said, good for you. Good for you. But she had this substance enough in her, ingrained in her from family, you know, from community, that she was not going to go backwards just to try and fit in as a new kid in town, as a new kid in that school. And she went through that whole acting white syndrome, and she told them where to go. So she's graduating, and we're very proud of her.
Oh, I bet you are. You know, the problem is so complex when you think about it. Not only is it structural, systemic, not only is, you know, the kids themselves become complicit. One of the things that I admired about the multi-ethnic think tanks was the coalition building and bringing, you know, people. When I attended the meetings, I saw people there from all kinds of groups, all kinds of, could be faith-based groups, could be community groups, parents, school people, and it seems to me that that kind of coalition building is so important if we're to make any systemic changes in in education. Just as one final question, because we're running out of time, do you have any advice on how to build those coalitions?
Well, one of the reasons the coalitions have difficulty getting traction is that they have no resources. Coalition building is very hard work. It's very long work. Coalition building is appreciated by everyone, but people want it done on a volunteer basis. So without the resources, the coalitions can't come together. The communication, the letter writing, the, you know, and they would be nice if they existed, but someone has to provide leadership. Someone has to identify resources. Someone has to follow through. Someone has to keep the coalition together. And there's not been an acknowledgement and recognition of the good those kinds of coalitions play in the overall scheme of things. And as a result of it, it's purely a volunteer basis. and there was only so many hours to go around.
Do you have any idea why OSPI pulled out? Because they were supporting it with funding and all in the beginning, and then.
Well, not really. They didn't pull out because they never were in. The multi-ethnic think tanks and the ethnic think tanks were an invention of Dr. Andy Griffin, who robbed from Peter to pay Paul. And this is where the resources came from. And when he ran out of resources, that was the end of bringing people together from around the state and all those various groups that you just identified. But OSPI was never in. They never did endorse the multi-ethnic think tank position paper that we wrote, remember?
Yes, I remember
and the
that.
goals we recommended.
Right.
So it wasn't a matter of pulled out. They never fully bought in.
That's very interesting. I've often wondered just what happened to the because I so admired it and couldn't figure out what had happened. Well, maybe this interview will help people rethink these issues, and maybe we could be a force for change again.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Thelma, for being my guest today on our program. And I'd like to invite our audience to take a look again at Thelma's article that appeared in our winter 2007 issue of the Journal of Educational Controversy. Thank you again, Thelma.
Thank you, Lorraine.